Well, this is very different than my usual discussion topic. So, I recently converted to Catholicism. I entered the church in January of 2025, and I'm currently going through a book called The Consecration to St. Joseph by Father Donald Calloway, who is actually going to be coming here to Nashville in April. So, this morning there was a section that really struck me. There's a shrine to St. Joseph in Calais, Poland, where St. John Paul II preached an inspiring homily to St. Joseph in 1997. And in the crypt of the church, there's a museum dedicated to St. Joseph in thanksgiving for his role in saving the lives of many Catholic priests imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp in World War II. And here I'm reading from page 168. There were many priests and bishops in Dachau concentration camp. According to official records, 2,579 Catholic priests were in Dachau. Of these, 1,034 of the priests died there. As for the other 1,545 priests who survived Dachau, all of them attribute their liberation from the camp on April 29th, 1945, to the powerful intercession of St. Joseph. As a matter of fact, those priests made a consecration to St. Joseph on December 8th of 1940 and made some renewals afterwards. Um, and it turns out that many priests were transferred to Dachau from Auschwitz and from Sachsenhausen concentration camps. So the reason this struck me was for two reasons, right? Definitely Catholics weren't the only ones that suffered under the Nazis. Protestants did too, and we'll get to Bonhoeffer in a moment. So, The Rise and the Fall of the Third Reich by William R. Shirer, I picked up many, many years ago. And there was a passage that I marked because, again, this is not something that typically gets mentioned in the history books, and this is on page 240. It would be misleading to give the impression that the persecution of Protestants and Catholics by the Nazi state toward the German people asunder, or even greatly aroused the vast majority of them. It did not. A people who had so lightly given up their political and cultural and economic freedoms were not, except for relatively few, going to die or even risk imprisonment to preserve freedom of worship. What really aroused the Germans in the 30s were the glittering success of Hitler in providing jobs, creating prosperity, restoring Germany's military. What the Hitler government envisioned for Germany was clearly set up in a 30-point program for the National Reich Church, drawn up during the war by Rosenberg, an outspoken pagan. Many of these things are just downright pagan in what they proclaimed. On the altars, there must be nothing but Mein Kampf, and left of the altar, a sword. On the day of its foundation, the Christian cross must be removed from all churches, cathedrals, and chapels, and it must be superseded only by the unconquerable symbol, the swastika. There's a lot more on this page that I'm skipping over here. Here it is. I have to circle back to a section that began on page 234 called The Persecution of the Christian Churches. It talks about the fact that there was a concordat signed between the Nazi government on July 20th and the Vatican. But on July 25th, 5 days after ratification of the Concordat, the German government promulgated a sterilization law, which particularly offended the Catholic Church. 5 days later, the first steps were taken to dissolve the Catholic Youth League. And here, I'll continue to just read. This is a whole quote. During the next years, thousands of Catholic priests, nuns, and lay leaders were arrested, many of them on trumped up charges of immorality or of smuggling foreign currency. Erich Klausener, leader of the Catholic Action, was, as we have seen, murdered on, on June 30th, 1934, during a purge. Scores of Catholic publications were suppressed, and even the sanctity of the confessional was violated by Gestapo agents. By the spring of 1937, the Catholic hierarchy in Germany, which, like most of the Protestant clergy, had first tried to cooperate with the new regime, was thoroughly disillusioned. And on March 14th, 1937, Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical, Mit brennender Sorge, with burning sorrow, charging the Nazi government with evasion and violation of the Concordat and accusing it of sowing the tares of suspicion, discord, hatred, calumny, of secret and open fundamental hostility to Christ and his church. On the horizon of Germany, the Pope saw the threatening storm clouds of destructive religious wars, which have no other aim than of extermination. Definitely, there were many Protestants that were persecuted as well under the Nazis. One of the most famous of which is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Many years ago, I read when I was still a Protestant, I read The Cost of Discipleship, where he's a Lutheran. He delves into costly grace versus cheap grace. And now looking back, it's kind of funny. It's like Bonhoeffer is realizing some of the problems that Luther's cheap grace had unleashed on the world. My father-in-law passed away, and I inherited from him. I went through his library and took my picks. This book by Bonhoeffer, which is Prisoner for God, which I need to read at some point as well. Bringing this kind of full circle now, the thing that struck me though was that I've had when I grew up, went to high school, and the teacher that taught me Latin for 2 years, his name was Gutaw Wincent, and he had actually taught my mother French. He was a polyglot, a polyglot. He was originally Polish. As it turns out, he was a law student, and he wrote a um, a retrospective on his life in Sachsenhausen from 1940 to 1945. He still had, of course, a tattoo on his wrist, um, his forearm, kind of up the forearm a little bit area, which he showed us one time in class when he got particularly incensed at us. Um, Mr. Mr. Vincent was probably one of my favorite teachers. I really enjoyed learning Latin from him. He used to begin every class with Incipiamos laborare discipuli. Let us begin to work now, students. And every time somebody had a birthday, we would sing Laetus Nautus Tibi, Laetus Nautus Tibi. And then finally, we all had to memorize the Pledge of Allegiance in Latin. Fidem meam vexillo obligo ob unitae statae Americae et re publicae proquastat indivisio. Um, let's see. And to the republic for which it stands. Proquastat. Indivisible, indivisio, cum libertate justitaque omnibus. Sorry, I got lost a little bit there in my mid-translation. Um, anyway, I thought it would be interesting to start to read from Sachsenhausen because you're not going to hear, this is history that never made it out of my hometown. And he does not go into great detail about his suffering, but he does do a little bit of talk about it. Here's a picture of him. Gustav Vincent was born in Yaroslav, Poland on January 1st, 1918 to the late Josef and Stanislava Sazinsko Vincentak. As a result of World War II, Mr. Vincent spent 5 years in confinement in Sachsenhausen, Orientenburg, concentration camp near Berlin, Germany. He was liberated by American forces in 1945. He and his late wife, Sophia, came to this country in 1951. He became a teacher in the school district where I grew up in 1955 and taught for 31 years. He became an institution in the language department as a result of his versatility in French, German, and Latin. Many of my friends took German from him. He received his master's degree from Miami University in Ohio, was a member of, here it is. He actually went to um, the Methodist Church where I sometimes popped in. Never recall seeing him there. This book is Mr. Vincent's original documentation of his experiences in the concentration camp. The text is his original composition. The final editing changes were made after his death, and the pictures were added. And here we begin on page 2. In Poland, give me a minute. In Poland, one could sense the proverbial winds of war. at least a year before the actual war began. The so-called Anschluss of Austria by Germany and the invasion of Czechoslovakia were giving some indication as far as Hitler's intentions were concerned. The Polish corridor, the narrow strip of land between the actual territory of Germany and East Prussia, became a next topic of Hitler's vehement oratories during the period of time before 1939. The daily Polish press, including the government's official publications, did not try to conceal the seriousness of the situation. Personally, I was not aware of any Polish military preparations for war at this particular time, but local administrations in various cities and villages were trying to lift up the spirit of the general population by organizing voluntary self-help emergency groups as an auxiliary to hospitals, fire departments, and acting Red Cross organizations. Some localities called their citizens to dig trenches in the specific perimeters located in the western directions. Looking back in the perspective of this time, I came to the conclusion that these trenches must have been the memory remnants of the veterans of World War I. Another fact which I have vividly remembered was taping the windows by the strips of paper on tape, which supposedly might have protected the glass from breaking. Believe it or not, this precaution was very useful in my later experience during the future artillery or aerial bombardments, excluding, of course, a direct hit. As for myself, I have to admit that this pre-war political atmosphere was to a certain degree distant to my mind. Being a student of the law school at Warsaw University, my primary concern was studying and working as a secretary to the local lawyer. These two endeavors kept me very busy from morning till late evening, whole week around. My work as a legal secretary provided me with the financial means for tuition, room and board, and for other physical necessities of the daily life. For many years, I had spent my summer vacations, much shorter than here in the USA, on the shores of the Baltic Sea, exactly on the peninsula called HEL. This is capital H, capital E, capital L. They were the most pleasant times of my life. After Poland regained its independence in 1918, the Treaty of Versailles offered this new nation a small access to the Baltic Sea through the Polish corridor mentioned previously. There was a highway from central Poland to the city of Gdynia, which later became a Polish main seaport, but the railroad line led directly through a short stretch of East Prussia and through the free city of Danzig, Gdansk, under the German administration. Traveling to the peninsula in the summer of 1939 in the month of August, our train was detained by Germans, and after only some negotiations with the train crew, were we allowed to proceed further. This was the first time when I encountered the open yet not yet bloodied hostility of our western neighbor. My stay this year at the Baltic shores, usually restful and carefree, was marred by the threatening news of border skirmishers and the warlike attitude of the German Nazi media. In the second half of August 1939, local Polish authorities were almost certain of the expected invasion, and for this first time I have noticed some movements and preparations of the regular Polish army and coastal navy. The tourists, I among them, had been advised to return as soon as possible to our regular places of residence. So, abandoning the idea of travel back by train, I took the opportunity to return to Warsaw by automobile. It took us a few days to overcome some difficulties, checkpoints, lack of gas, and impossibility to buy it, since almost all gas stations were requisitioned by the administrative and military authorities, many detours, etc., in order to return to Warsaw, where we had arrived on the last days of August. Here, the atmosphere was just as tense as in many places and localities through which I passed. Here, the atmosphere, back in Warsaw, here the atmosphere was just as tense as in many places and localities through which I passed on the way back. The press and radio was proclaiming openly not only the possibility but the assurance of open invasion. I was concerned about the certainty of being called to military duty since the majority of students were expecting to receive the drafting paper to the armed forces. We did not think much about continuation of our studies, and many professors were talking about the closing of academia in case of war. But above all, young people my age, who were born in this young democratic republic, were filled with patriotic emotions. But above all, young people my age, who were being born in this young democratic republic, were filled with patriotic emotions and spirit, And of course, we're ready to join the ranks of the defenders. And here I'll pause on page 4 and pick it up sometime soon.